Hello everyone and welcome to this video lecture on Rhino. Today we're looking at how to export for presentation. So say we're at the stage where we're doing something like this. I've been looking at a surface treatment for my assignment. I've been looking in particular at the wall treatment, and I've been looking at a tile design for one of my iterations, one of my options. So I've got this grid that I've laid out with a few different tests on it. I've been looking at a few different tools from curves, surfaces, solids, and I'm pretty happy now with this particular set. So what I want to do is have a look at a few of my options in terms of how to present this visually. Now, pretty much the only thing you can't do is take a screenshot from this and chuck it on a PDF and tell us that's your work. That really doesn't give us a lot to go with. So we need to go a little bit deeper in terms of how we can present this visually using some of the skills and the techniques that we already know from previous semesters. So we already know how to use AutoCAD, we already know how to use Illustrator, and we know how to present in a professional architectural manner. So what we need to do is we need to get Rhino to export out so that we can use those techniques that we already understand. So first thing I want to look at is a tool called the Make 2D tool. So when you're in Rhino, if you were to go straight to File, Export, it would give you the option to make an Adobe Illustrator file and also to create a AutoCAD file as well. So we've got both of them here, Adobe Illustrator and AutoCAD. The issue is that Rhino can't discern through the export function which lines you want and which lines you don't want. So if you were to do that, it would take every single line, curve, everything that's in this model and project it into Illustrator or AutoCAD. And editing that would be a nightmare. You'd think you're editing one line in order to experiment with the line weights, and there's actually 10 different lines there, or 100 or 1,000. So it really does get quite complicated if you want to export directly into those software. So we need to do some work before we get there, and that's where the Make 2D command comes in handy. So say we want to start taking some of these surfaces that we've made, some of these tiles out. First thing you want to do is separate them out. We can do it all as one in a grid shape like this to show some of the iterations, but when we get to showing individual tiles, it's best to actually separate them away, because as you'll see, they'll start getting on top of each other in a little bit when we do some more work. So we don't want to have them in the way. We just want to look at one at a time. I'm going to set my camera and place target on this guy at the moment because I want to be able to move around it. There we go. Much easier to move around the one spot. So get yourself a viewpoint that you feel really represents the object, and you can do a few different views of course, but I think something like this really presents this quite nicely. So first thing we want to do is select the object we want to take a snapshot of, and we type in Make 2D. We're going to get a few options here. We do want the perspective view, that's the view we're looking at right now, so we want to take a 2D shot of that. We want the view, import objects, don't show us the hidden lines, and then we go apply. Now it may take a little bit of time, so you may have to wait a little while depending on how complex it is. Don't click anywhere when it's finished because it's going to flatten out some objects for you, and you want to make sure they all stay together. So the first thing you want to do is just type in group so that you can group it all together, and now you should be able to move it around. I'm going to jump over to the top view so I can see now what I'm looking at, and we can see it's made a nice 2D image of lines for us. So we could now take this into Illustrator. We could play with some of the line weights. We could put some shadow or some gradients over the top to emphasize what we're looking at. You can see how the Make 2D tool works. Whatever screen we were looking at, it will take a flat 2D projection of that and effectively get rid of all of the background lines that we don't want and give us only the lines of what we do right. If we wanted to make a 2D of a plan, So if I wanted a top-down view, I'd be able to do the same thing as well. So let's say I want this grid of spheres. So we've got here over the top of our surface. Again, we're going to just move it out of the way just to make things a little bit easier for us. Zoom down to it, select everything we want, make 2D, and this time we're in the top view, so we're looking directly down onto it this time. Hidden lines, yep, we don't want to see any of that stuff, just the view, and just group the output. I click apply. Again, don't click anywhere while it's done. You just want to type in group, and then you'll be able to scan over to where it is. And I have it over here grouped together. And I can just move it to where I would need it. And I've got a plan view looking down over the top. Now, plan view, as you can see, doesn't always show us all of the lines we want because there is depth to that surface of spheres. It's only really getting full circles for the ones that were closest to the view plane, and then no circles for the ones that are further away. So it's trying to map an image that is representative of what was there rather than a true plan. So you need to keep that in mind when you're making these drawings as well. You might need to go back in and do some further drawing. So Make 2D will work in any view plane that you would like it to. Now, something that we particularly like to use for our architectural visualization is, of course, the axonometric. So in order to construct an axonometric, you will need to change one of your viewpoints. So let's say we're currently in perspective, and yes, I really like that perspective that showed, but I also need a proper axonometric, a scale view. Jump over, right click on perspective, set view, and then you want to go to isometric, and it'll ask you based on your coordinates where you want to be. I click on southwest because I'm coming from this way, the southwest, according to our construction plane. And then I can now zoom in to where I want to be. This is a true axonometric. So I can click this and then do my make 2D again, and it will give me this viewport rather than the other one we had over here. When we're finished with that, we just go back up to where it says parallel now, set view, and put it back on perspective. And you'll be able to navigate back to where your perspective view is again. That's all well and good for our 2D representations in perspective, axonometric, and plan, but sometimes that's not really going to work for us, particularly when we're in the section mode. And of course, we're going to need to cut some sections through some pretty difficult things to manually draw out ourselves. So we're going to have to look at a few ways to draw these sections. So let's take one of these complicated surfaces that we have here. Again, I'm just going to pull this one out just to make life a little bit easier when we're doing our selections later. Pull it out over here, and I'm going to come up to a new set of tools. So curve, then curve from objects is going to give us a lot of really helpful tools to create some line work. So the first one I want to look at is section. So what are we going to take a section through? That's this. And then where do we want the start of our section to be? I want my section to be going through this mass that's here. So I'm going to click here in this plane, click to the other side with my ortho turned on. We can see it up here. Click, and that is going to cut a section through that exact point in space. I can cut another one if I want to. I'm just going to press enter for now. Again, type in group. That's going to group it together, and now we can move it away from that point there. And that's given us a 2D section cut going through that exact point in the model. And we can take as many sections as we need to. This is particularly useful for us for our presentation where we want to cut some sections to show how the plane is actually working, how it might be responding to a normal like a wall. If this is one of your wall materials, you want to see how it's actually working in section, how it comes away from the wall. That section tool is going to be really useful for you. Another one that we have access to is contour. So say, for example, one section really isn't going to do it. It's not going to tell us enough. We need to see more often and at the same interval, sections being cut through a complicated surface. So let's go back up to curve from objects, and now we want to use contour. So contour is going to create, as you might have guessed from our contour maps when we're drawing site plans, regular lines at regular intervals for us. So what do we want to take contours of? This surface. Contour plane base point. So we're going to take some perpendicular cuts to whatever line we draw next. So we want it to go along this surface in this direction here. So I'm going to draw a perpendicular plane again, make sure our ortho is turned on. I click here, it's going to start cutting some vertical lines this way, the opposite direction in whatever way this line's going in. So if I go this way, it's going to go up the surface. Now I need to say at what regular distance do I want. I'm going to go ahead with 4 millimeters for this one, and I click enter, and there we have it. I have my curves. If I delete the surface, you'll see that these curves are exactly where this surface was. So wherever the section lined up at that particular point, every 4 millimeters, it's taken a new line for us. I can go in the opposite direction if I want to, so I go contour again. I want this surface. Now I want to go the opposite way. I want 4 millimeters again. There we have it. We have a grid of curves that now map out our surface for us. This is not only a useful tool for your drawing and presentation, it's also a really useful tool for creating a grid of points for you to do some other interesting things. So if you didn't want to do an array surface like we've done up here, you wanted to be able to manipulate certain points on a surface, this is a way that you could grid out all of your points very, very quickly as well. So you've got all of your U lines and your V lines organized for you. Another trick we can do with our surface, if we Command Z a little bit there, is we can go in the opposite plane. So we can, instead of cutting section cuts, we can start cutting some plan cuts through this surface. So let's have a look at that. Go back up to curve from objects, contour. Yes, I want this surface, enter. Now I'm going to click here, but first I'm going to jump out of perspective view over to my front view, and or maybe my side view. Which one? There we go, that one's easier, my right view. I want to go up in the Z axis, so I need to be in this elevation view so that I can use my ortho to lock that out. I could click in there. Then it's going to ask me again, what's the distance between my contours? This time, because we're in plan, I want them to be closer together because I really want to see what's going on. So this time I'm going to do 2 millimeters for my contours. So every time it will jump down by 2 millimeters. We go back to perspective and we can see it's created a contour map over the top of the surface that we had here. So everywhere that there was a lump, we now see a new line every time we go down by 2 millimeters, exactly the same as how contours would work on a map. But now we have 3-dimensional lines. So if we're to delete this surface, you'll see that these lines are actually sitting in 3 dimensions like this. There they are, those lines, which is again quite useful for you. So if you wanted to make it more obvious in your surface when you take it over to Illustrator where the curves are and how it's working, you could do a contour before you take it out. Or if you wanted to take a top plan view, but the Make 2D isn't showing you very much, you could contour first so that we can see how that is actually working. You may have already seen out of the corner of your eye before, contour is also useful for creating some interesting geometries like this one. So we'll jump over to our perspective and we see that I've actually created a surface out of my contours. So those lines that I had contour before, I have kept my surface in there, but I've then used the pipe command. And then I've just set the radius at about 1 or 2 millimeters for each one of these pipes. And then that just tells Rhino that everywhere there's a curve selected, I want to have this pipe running through it. And then that creates another very interesting geometry coming out of there as well. So Contour, again, a very powerful tool, and there's a few more in there as well that you can have a look at the curve from objects. Namely, the extract ISO curve is probably going to be one of the most useful for you. Let's say we're on this surface again. Extract ISO curve allows you to see where you're going to take your section through in real time. So before, where we had to kind of guess where we wanted our section to cut, extract ISO curve allows you to be very specific about it. And so you could move it along a specific dimension. You can go either the U direction or in the V direction. So we can run this way now, up to you. And then once you click on that, you can do multiple if you want to, at whatever intervals you need. Doesn't have to be regular. Press enter when they're done, and then you can move them out of the way. So extract ISO curve is kind of the opposite of the contour. Instead of it being at regular intervals, you set it at whatever interval you would like. Okay, so let's say we don't want to take any more make 2Ds. We actually want some screenshots because we want this shadow to be in here. We would like the way the light rolls around this particular surface that we've got going on here. So what we need to do is make some changes to our background settings because we don't want the grid in our shot and we don't want this gray tone in the shot either. First thing I'm going to do though is once again just move this surface that we've created way out of shot so that it's easier to keep everything else out. Particularly now that we're going to be taking a screenshot, we just want to have a field of gray going on here. So that's kind of interesting from that angle. Do we like this one better? No, this one's better. Okay, so you'll play around with this, get the angle the way you want it to be, and then kind of just center it in the middle of your screen. All right, now we go over to Rhino and Preferences, and we need to go up into our display modes. So we're, of course, in our shaded view at the moment, and we can see the background is set to the Use Application settings. I want to change that to solid color. And I've got my solid color set as white and apply here. Now you might be still on the grid over here, so you might want to turn your grid off as well, and I'll quickly show you how to do that. So again, jump back into your preferences, display modes, jump over to grid, and then use mode specific settings for the grid. And we just turn these ones off. Show grid axis, show grid axis icon. Sorry, forgot to change it to shaded first. So we would just go back over to here, and there we go. No grid axis, and then a little icon down here, we can get rid of that as well if we don't want that as part of our screenshot. We click out of that, go back to our view. Now, do not take a Command Shift for screenshot or a snipping tool screenshot for this. It will be low resolution and it won't look good for your presentation. So we want to do a screenshot in the correct way. And that's very easy to do. We jump up to View, then we go to Capture, and then to File. View, Capture to File. It's going to ask you in what viewport. We're happy with the perspective. Resolution is going to be our screen. That's fine because we're going to take lots of these different images, but you can also control that as well. So you can bump up to whatever resolution you like. I always change this over to millimeters from pixels because that allows me to edit the resolution as well. So the dots per inch I can change up to 300, which will be much better once it gets printed out. Typically the screen resolution's at 72 and it looks fine on screen, but take it to the printer, it doesn't look fine anymore. So change to millimeters and then to 300 first. Click apply, save it wherever you would like to save it. I'll just chuck it in my downloads folder. Click save. And we see we have our image here. Beautiful. Lines look good. We can now take that over to Illustrator and that will sit over the top of a white background. So it will be nice on the page and very easy to organize. Now, you might be wondering why we're looking in shaded view instead of rendered view. After all, when we want some renders to come out. The issue for me is that depending on what you're doing with your surfaces and depending on what sort of geometries you're playing with, whether they're rectilinear, the curve, how the light's falling off and what normals they're pointing towards the camera or not, we lose a lot of information. We get what's called whiteout, we end up with some of the image, but not all of it. And some parts look really good and other parts don't. And too much for my liking gets lost. So what I usually say is that shaded is better because it also provides the line work. So anywhere that would usually be whited out, we end up with line work, which kind of catches the difference and allows us to see both where we have shade for curvature, where the blocks are opening, but also the quote dead spots, end quote, as well. So you want to make sure you're using shaded instead of rendered when you're taking these out into Illustrator. All right, I'll quickly show you how to change it back because of course while we're working we need to be able to change these back. So use document settings for the grid. General, that's already fine. Shaded, we're going to take that back. So background needs to be use application settings to go back to gray, and grid we need to change this back to use document settings as well, and that once we zoom out you'll see has turned everything back to normal. So we have our gray, we have our grid, and we've got our little construction plane world view as well. It's also important to remember to only ever take one screenshot or one image of any particular surface at a time. So while it might look really nice the way we had it before in a grid layout with all of them laid out together, typically what you'll find is the resolution jumps down way too much. And all of these lines that are here together that kind of look really black are going to come out exactly that way when we take them over to Illustrator and we try and print them. If we were to take it from this level and then take a shot for each one of our tiles and then put them together in Illustrator, each tile will have this level of resolution. So again, you really just want to take one tile or one surface at a time and then clip them all together in Illustrator. That will allow you to make sure that all of the resolution is the same. Okay, well, let's say that we're finished with our contouring, we're finished with cutting our sections, we've got the images that we want in terms of screenshots. Now we want to take out some of that beautiful line work that we've generated. So let's look at this one here as an example. Jump over to our top view. The same principle applies to all of your line work. So what you'll do is you'll select it, just the parts you want. Then we're going to go over to export selected, not export. Remember, export is going to take everything and it's going to be a real nightmare to edit later. So we just want to export selected, and that's always just going to be our make 2D. So we're going to make 2D first. Even if we're in plan view, we make 2D. That way we're only ever dealing with one line in any given direction. Export selected. It's going to ask once again what you would like. Typically, I would just jump straight to Adobe Illustrator. If you prefer, you can edit first in AutoCAD and then bring it over to Illustrator through the techniques we looked at last semester. But I would usually just jump straight into Illustrator. Let's click Export. It's going to ask you for a few different options here. So you can scale the model, you can play with the RGB, CMYK, etc. What we're going to do is just take it as a snapshot of the current view. If you were to preserve the model scale, remember you're dealing at 1:1 in Rhino. So while we're going to be looking at 1:1 modeling later on in the semester, while we're just presenting, we don't really want it to be 1:1 on the page for every single drawing. Yes, we can do that for the detailed drawings. We can send them out at scale so we know they're scaled. But for now, while we're looking at just taking them into Illustrator to present these, and we're just going to manipulate them, scale them around anyway in Illustrator, we'll just leave this as a snapshot of the current view. We click Export, and we've now got an Illustrator file that's finished in there. So let's open that one up in Illustrator, and we can see that, as per usual, it's come through really thick and really heavy. So we would just jump over to 0.1, and that really thins it down a bit. Always check your page size that it came in at. So it's come in at A4 at the moment, which is fine. We would usually bump that up to an A3, but you can see how big that's going to be on an A4. You can then go ahead and play with each of the lines. So you might go around your edge lines and bump them up like we would do in a normal axonometric, just to make them a bit more visible like that, or maybe even more visible again. Bump these up to 0.7, something like that. Experiment with it, get it looking the way you want it to look. So your layers will come through relative to the layer that it was exported on. So if all of your export, so all of your make 2Ds are all of the one layer. It's just going to come through on one layer. So if you do need them to be separated out when you bring them through, just make sure they're on separate layers in Rhino before you do export selected, and then that way you'll have your layers preserved inside there in Illustrator. So at the moment, if I click on select, obviously there's only one layer, so it's going to select everything inside that viewport. In Illustrator, what we would do is we would, of course, edit the line work, make it look the way we want it to look. We can put some gradients in, put some colors into edges if we want to. We can annotate it with some text. Usually we would go ahead and make this smaller because we're going to put a grid of these coming through, showing each of our different surface translations and what we've been experimenting with, which is an important point to reiterate. There's going to be a lot of imagery that you're bringing over from Rhino because you've done so many experiments and you've made so many different make 2Ds in axonometric plan section, contours. There's heaps and heaps of stuff. So you want to be really careful about your layouts and use the same professional standards that we talked about last semester. Make sure that you're using a grid, make sure that there's hierarchy, so the less important things are all the same size and the medium importance things are the next size up, and then maybe have one or two really important things which are the largest, and that gives us an indication of what we're looking at. So for example, this tile surface, we might have a large image off to the side, which is a perspective that shows a whole bunch of these tiles laid out on a wall and maybe a person up against them so we can see human scale. And that might sit in the bottom quarter of the image. And then we have another half of an image here, which runs through some of the iterations. And then up the top here is the bulk of the iterations and all the testing, and they're the smallest. Each piece has a little bit of text. So that's how we would create hierarchy to the sheet. And this is, again, why we would use Illustrator as well, because it gives us so much more control. We can drag and drop our imagery into Illustrator as well. Remember, we've taken perspectives and screenshots out of there, so we'd be able to scale these down. And the beauty of making our Rhino white background before is that once it sits onto the paper, it's just going to float nicely in space as well. So it'll look much like the drawing. It'll sit there beautifully in terms of the presentation. Other things you want to add, of course, are your sketches, different drawings, diagrams, things that you've been thinking about. You might have even made some hand models to try and test some ideas. We need to see precedents and precedent analysis. Remember, your material studies and your material exploration is a big part of this semester's work. So on these pages, don't forget to show your precedents on the actual pages. We need to be able to draw connections from the material manifesto, the research that you've been doing, into your final surfaces, your final materials, and your proposed surfaces for the pavilion, the house that you're creating. If we don't see that connection, one could assume that this is just arbitrary shape making in Rhino, that you've just got some random tools, chucked them all together, and then created a surface. Well, where's the connection there? Where's the research? So make sure that you are connecting the dots for us in your presentation. Connect us from the original idea through the sketches, the precedents, how they've molded the idea, the iterations, and then through to the final product and what it might look like if it were on a wall, if it were on a roof, if it were an interior, if it were a screen, whatever it is. Make sure that it's really clear that we can see all of the beautiful work that you've been doing. So that's all for exporting. All of these techniques work, of course, for any stage that you're at in the presentation, whether it's the first draft or the final. You can still use these techniques. Make 2D, cut some sections, create some contours, export out an image, export selected to Illustrator and take the lines with you. All of these things are still very, very useful tools for all of your future work in Rhino. So as usual, experiment, have fun with it. We want to see lots and lots and lots of work coming through. This would only be one experiment within one type. So within the wall, exterior wall, interior, roof, and screen, this might be only one wall exterior experiment, and then we'd have multiple of those. So again, connection to precedent would be there. We would see where your working has come from in terms of the sketching, the analysis, and the progression. It wouldn't just be arbitrary shape making like mine is here. Have fun, experiment a lot, enjoy.